The X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, rel-mar McConnell Media Company, the X Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell, and we're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. Now, if you'd like to send me an email, xzone at xzoneradiotv.com, on all social media sites, Xzone Radio TV. And for the programming schedule that we have available for you, with our programming 24/7, 365, visit xzbn.net. And for the X Zone TV channel on Simul TV, www.simultv.com. X Zone Nation, my guest this hour is Dr. Scott Kolbaba, and he is the author of Physicians' Untold Stories. His website is www.physiciansuntoldstories.com. And Dr. Kolbaba is an internist in private practice in Wheaton, Illinois. He graduated from the University of Illinois College of Medicine with honors and did his residency at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago and at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He has been awarded membership in the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Medical Society and has been featured in the Chicago Magazine as a top doctor in internal medicine. Joining me now is Dr. Scott Kolbaba. And Doctor, welcome to the X Zone.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be here.
Your book has a very interesting title, Physicians' Untold Stories. Tell us a little bit about the title and what was your inspiration in writing this book?
Well, the title comes because there are so many doctors that have unusual stories that don't share them. We doctors don't talk about deep subjects very much. We talk about gallbladders and our golf game and what we're doing on the weekend, but the stories that I happened to collect were really, really very deeply spiritual and unusual stories. And I was very surprised because I'd been in practice for about 25 years before I even started to hear some of these stories. And so I thought that the title of the book would be very appropriate as Physicians' Untold Stories, because these are basically untold. And the reason they are is the physicians were afraid that they would lose their patients or lose their credibility when they shared some of these supernatural experiences with me.
What was the first story that you were told by a patient that was the idea for everything you've done since that very first encounter with that patient?
I think one of the first stories that I had was a fellow, Taylor Manning was his name, and Taylor was traveling outside the state, and he called me up because he was having some right upper abdominal pain. And I said, it sounds like gallbladder. It was typical after eating. And I said, you better get to the emergency room, which he did. They saw him in the emergency room. They did all the tests, and it was all negative. They gave him some narcotic, and he seemed to get better. But I said, when you come home, Taylor, let's take a look at you and make sure that you're okay. So he came home. He was still having the pain. So at that point, I ordered some of their sophisticated tests, thinking that, the hospital didn't do all the right tests, and I ordered some fancier tests, and everything came back normal. And he was still having a great deal of pain right upper abdomen, again, very typical for gallbladder. And so I didn't quite know what to do with him, but it was really unusual. After about 3 or 4 days, after a couple of additional tests, I woke up in the morning thinking I have to call him this morning and talk with him. And that's really unusual. It was about 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning. So I called I called him up. I'm sure I woke him up. And I said, I'm thinking about you, and I had this idea that you need a lung scan. And he said, well, that's kind of unusual because this is an abdominal pain. Why would I need a lung scan? And I said,
Right.
I just had this feeling, this overwhelming feeling that I couldn't get out of my system. So he said, well, I can't do it today because I'm flying off to Denver. And so I didn't know quite what to do. I said, when is your flight leave? He said, about 2:30 in the afternoon. So I said, if I can get you the scan first thing in the morning, would you go for it? He paused for quite a while and finally said, okay. So I called the radiology department. I told them what I was looking for. They kind of laughed at me, for doing a lung scan for a person with abdominal pain, but they decided to go ahead with me. So they told him to come right over. He went over there, and about an hour later, I got a call from the radiologist. Radiologist said, nice call, Scott. How'd you think of a lung scan? And I said, I just woke up this morning and thought about it. And he said, well, you probably saved his life. He had a massive pulmonary embolus sitting on his diaphragm on the right side of his lung. Had we not done the lung scan and he flew off to Denver, he might not have survived.
How did that affect you personally, Dr. Scott?
I was really shaken up. You get weak knees when these kinds of things happen to you, and you get the goosebumps, and you think, boy, there's something else that was looking out for him and out for me that morning when I woke up. And so after that, you let that pass, and it impresses you for a while. But then, the busyness of life takes on, and the usual humdrum of things. But then a couple other docs came to me with unusual stories that I've never heard before. And after I heard those stories, I thought, I better write these down. This is so incredible. And I wondered if other doctors had stories like those also. And I started asking. And I was very, very surprised in my interviewing with 200 or 300 doctors that many doctors had unusual experiences. And the ones that gave me goosebumps or made me tear up were the ones I put in the book.
200 or 300 doctors. Now, if they were the stories that you were told by them, can you just imagine how many untold other stories there are out there?
There have to be millions.
Yeah.
And what I've learned too, Rob, is that it's not just the doctors that have these stories. I think in talking with my patients, and I love to tell these stories to my patients. I always get behind in the office when I'm telling these stories, but I've found that when I tell these stories, frequently, I should say, many patients will say, well, it's neat that you told me that story because I had one like that, or my mother had one like this. Yeah. And it's amazing how many people have had these supernatural, miraculous, spiritual experiences that they're all also afraid to tell.
Here you are, a Western medical practitioner, highly recognized as a professional. You've spoken to 200-300 other doctors in the Western medical field who have had these experiences. How do you, or can you even explain how these happen?
Well, the doctors have their own explanations, and I think and I do too, and I think most of the doctors would say these are divine interventions from God.
Okay.
And you can believe what you want. You can believe a force is out there, that the universe, but most of the docs that I talk with said this was just an intervention from God, and it saved someone or saved me, or it did incredible things to move something along.
I believe in divine intervention, so I can fully understand that. How did the other doctors feel about revealing these stories to you, knowing full well that they were going to be published? Did they fear ridicule? Did they fear retribution from other members of the profession?
Absolutely. These are unusual stories. And the docs that I interviewed, I've known for many, many years, some of them over 30 years.
My goodness.
And I picked the docs that I knew were straight arrow docs, kind of boring at parties. They just like to do their work. They were great doctors. They had no reason to gain anything from telling these stories. And so they were all very hesitant to tell me. As a matter of fact, Dave Mokel, who's a great orthopedic surgeon, who told me one of the first stories, ran up to me in the hallway, and he said, Scott, I've got to tell you this story about a mutual patient. And I said, okay, Dave, go ahead and tell me. And he said, well, I can't tell you here. Someone might hear me. So we had to go into a private room on the floor where there were no patients in the room. And he went on to explain an incredible story. And I said, well, Dave, who did you tell the story to already? And he said, my wife, and that's it, no one else. And so that's kind of what the the theme was for the doctors. They were afraid that something would happen to them. And then the next question, Rob, obviously is, well, why did they let me publish these stories if they were afraid that people would,
Exactly.
would leave their practice, or the doctors would shun them and so forth? I think one of the things I discovered about docs, and again, it was really fun to interview these doctors because I was able to really get into the heart of a doctor, the soul of a doctor, as to what makes them tick. I think the thing that they expressed to me was that they wanted to make a difference in the world. They wanted people to know that there's something else out there.
Right.
And that desire to be what I called sappy do-gooders was greater than the fear of losing their practices and losing their colleagues. And as it turned out, no one was shunned by their patients. No colleagues were ostracized.
Right.
It turned out to be the greatest thing that ever happened, because many patients have come up to me and other doctors and said, thank you for telling these stories, because now we feel better ourselves about sharing our own stories and our family stories. So it's turned out to be just the opposite of what we were afraid of.
All right, please stand by, Dr. Scott. You and I have to take our first break. And Duxon Nation, if you'd like to get more information or buy this book, it's a great book for the Christmas season. And I must tell you, I've had the opportunity of going to Dr. Scott's website. It's fantastic. Check it out at www.physiciansuntoldstories.com. And Dr. Scott Kolbaba and I will be back on the other side of this commercial break as we continue here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. I'm Rob McConnell. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Dr. Scott Kolbaba is our special guest of this hour. He is the author of Physicians Untold Stories. His website, physiciansuntoldstories.com. Over the years, Dr. Scott, has there been one story that you have heard, whether it is from one of your own patients or one of your colleagues' patients, that has just kind of shaken you?
Yes, yeah, there are a couple.
Okay.
Two that I love particularly. Let me tell you one about Grandma O'Hanlon.
Okay.
Grandma O'Hanlon, now this is about Dr. Jack Heitzler, who's a gynecologist and obstetrician. He's delivered two of our babies, and the babies have actually grown up and are normal people. And Jack was in the delivery room with his wife. His wife was delivering their fifth child. And Grandma O'Hanlon, who was a midwife and Joan's grandmother, stepped in and saved Joan's life. And the story goes something like this. When Joan was a little girl, her grandmother went to live with her when she couldn't deliver babies anymore. She was a midwife in Chicago. And Joan and grandmother became very close, incredibly loving relationship. And Joan would kid around and say, if I could make it to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap, I'd always be safe from my mother, who would sometimes get in trouble with her mother. And so Joan was delivering their fifth child. And after the delivery, there was some retained placenta. And so she had to have an additional procedure, and she was starting to have a lot of pain. So at the time, they decided to give her a drug called trilene, which is a mask that goes over the face. And it puts a woman into deep sleep, and they can do the procedure, and then they take it off, and within a few minutes, it's gone.
Right.
And so they were ready to put the mask over Joan's face to give her the anesthesia when Grandma O'Hanlon stepped into the room. Little old Grandma O'Hanlon was dressed in her typical white polka dot dress, a little sweater vest on, her hair up in the bun, white hair up in the bun, little old lady shoes. And she stood at the foot of the bed and shook her head and said, basically, Joan, don't do that. So Joan pushed the mask away. And she didn't know why, so she had to suffer a little bit with the pain. But no one realized that Joan had eaten a very large meal right before she went into labor. And about 30 seconds after she pushed the mask away, she vomited the entire meal.
Ooh.
Had she been in deep sleep, you can imagine, Rob, what would have happened. She'd have aspirated all that vomitus and might have died from an aspiration pneumonia. So Joan says that she made it back to Grandma O'Hanlon's lap one last time, having transcended time and eternity, because Grandma O'Hanlon had died 22 years before.
My heavens.
That's one of my favorite stories.
Can you give us another one, sir?
Sure. The one I like, too, is about, this is one of the first ones I heard. This was from Steve Heim, who is an orthopedic surgeon. And this is this is a fun story because Steve is a great orthopedic surgeon. He's also a trauma surgeon, and Steve was kind of burned out from the busyness of life and the busyness of his practice. So he decided to take his wife and his wife's sister on a skiing trip to Colorado, and they're expert skiers, and Steve is particularly good at anything in athletics. So they were going down this mountain they'd never been down before. And when they got to the top of the mountain, there was a sudden blizzard that hit. The temperature dropped about 40 degrees. The snow was coming down so hard they could hardly see more than 10 feet in front of them. But they had to ski down, so they started skiing. And Steve and the girls were skiing together as much as they could see each other. And then they came to a grove of trees, and they could all go to the right or the left. Steve decided to go to the right, and he thought the girls were with him, but they happened to go to the left, following a group of other people. When Steve realized that they were on the other side of the grove of trees, he decided to ski through this 5 feet of powder snow, which, again, he's an expert skier. There was no problem at all. And as he's skiing, he suddenly had this feeling, this premonition, this unusual feeling. It was in his chest, like something was being told to him, and he didn't know quite what it was. And all of a sudden, he said, things got very still and very quiet, despite the wind blowing like crazy, the snow coming down sideways and upside down. It was a very eerie silence. He could hear himself breathe. He could hear the skis and the snow. And he decided then that he didn't know what to do, but he decided to stop. So he stopped skiing right in the middle of this grove of trees. Now, he didn't know why the heck he stopped. And then he took off his skis and stood there for a minute. Again, it was this eerie silence, and it was a feeling that he was being called to do something that had life and death implications, and he had no idea what it was. So he started to then climb up the mountain. Now, this is in the opposite direction of where the girls were actually waiting for him. He couldn't see the girls, but he knew that they were on the other side of the grove of trees, and he's climbing up this mountain, climbing and walking and climbing in mountains. It's a steep mountain. And he came to a big tree, and under the tree there's like a tree well. You'd know from Canada what those look like.
Yes.
There was a big well that goes down to the base of the tree. Mm-hmm. And he stood there wondering what the heck he's doing here. And again, it's very quiet, and he has this feeling in his chest. And then he looked down, and he knew why he was there. Covered with snow, under the tree was a body.
Oh, my gosh.
So Steve decided to brush off the head and see if he was alive or dead. And he realized that he was dead because he wasn't breathing. He had a kind of a gray face. But as a trauma surgeon, he's trained to do certain things, and he went into this trauma mode. And he reached down to his neck and felt his carotid artery, which was he had a pulse. It was a very thready pulse. He could hardly tell he was alive, but he was alive. So Steve suddenly, started to call out, "Help! Help!" One of the last skiers down the mountain heard his cry, came to his side. Steve said, "Go down and get the snow patrol as soon as you can, the ski patrol, and send him up here. This fellow's almost dead." About 15 minutes later, he saw the light from the snowmobile, and the gurney was being pulled behind it. They loaded up this unconscious, shocky skier, and they took him down to the lodge, and they had the ambulance waiting and whisked him off to the hospital. Steve, in the meantime, had used his jackets to cover the skier and did all the things that he needed to do, and he was shivering with both adrenaline and also cold. Got his clothes back on, zipped out as fast as he could to the girls, which were still waiting on the other side of the grove of trees, and then skied down the mountain. There he got his reward, a cup of hot chocolate. Man. The next day, he called up the hospital and said, "What happened to that skier?" And they said, "You won't believe this. The skier is perfectly fine. There's no frostbite. The leg that was broken, that Steve actually splinted in the field with his underclothes and a tree branch, was perfectly splinted. They didn't have to make any reset of the bones. And the skier was perfectly fine." And I said, "Steve, how do you account for that? What happened there?" Yeah. And he said, "It's got to be someone from above, because if I hadn't found that skier, he wouldn't be found until the next year when the snow melted."
Good God.
And he said that day, 2 people were saved. And I said, "What do you mean 2 people were saved?" And he said, "The skier was saved, but I was saved too." And I said, well, why were you saved, Steve? And he said, I've been living with the tragedy of my father. My father and I were skiing in Michigan 2 years before. He arrested on the snowfield.
Oh, my gosh.
And I couldn't save him. We did CPR for an hour, and we lost his life. And I blamed myself for his death. So ever since then, I've carried that guilt with me that I was responsible for his death. And he said, this event, this deja vu experience that I had, taught me and showed me that I'm not in charge of life and death, that someone else is, and I got a second chance. And I said, Steve, do you think your dad was in cahoots with all this from above? And he said, there's no question he was. So 2 people were saved that day, and that I love that story. It's got lots of meaning to it, I think.
It certainly does. It shows that there's something that there are many things, in my opinion, Dr. Scott, that happen to us on a daily basis that we have no idea about, and that life is much more spiritual, if you'll excuse the expression, than we will ever understand, except for people like yourself and these other fine doctors who have these experiences and who know firsthand that there is something called divine intervention and that there is more to life than the physiology that we all believe we understand.
And that was one of the points we're trying to get out with the book, Rob, and that is, look around you. There are little coincidences and big coincidences happening to you every day, and pay attention to those. And some of those are not coincidental. Some of those are truly divine intervention. I had a crazy experience getting into medical school. Did you know how I finally got into medical school?
No, sir.
I was not a great student in college, and so I majored in economics and art. I was a potter, and then after I graduated, I decided to go back to medical school. And I didn't have the grades, I didn't have the prerequisites, and I had to take some night classes. And I'd been working on this for about 3 years. And finally, the last year, my wife and everyone said to me, "Okay, Scott, you probably have one more year to try to do this. And if you don't get into medical school, you better get a real job and get on with life." So I had this last year to get the prerequisites, and the one I needed to get was organic chemistry. So organic chemistry was offered in the town that I was working in, which was perfect, Aurora, Illinois. I enrolled in the class. There were lots of books in the library. I got one of the books and went to the class. There were only 3 students in the class, and they canceled the class.
Oh.
I was heartbroken because this was only offered in one other school in the state, and that was Roosevelt University in downtown Chicago. So I zipped down there the next day, and I thought, well, I'll just enroll in organic chemistry there. I'll be all set. I got to the head of the line with the registrar, and she said, "I'm sorry, the organic chemistry class is filled. We opened up a second class, and that's filled, and we have 9 students on the waiting list, all with the same story that you have." My heart sunk. I thought, my life is over. I'll never become a doctor. I don't know what to do. So I said, who makes the ultimate decision about organic chemistry enrollment? And she said, it's the professor. And I said, well, where does the professor live? And she said, the 3rd floor, room 303. So I ran up the stairs, stumbling half the way, got to a room that was loaded with students.
All right, what we're going to do here, Scott, is we're going to do a bit of a cliffhanger because I do have to take my news break at the bottom of the hour. Exonation, our guest this hour is Dr. Scott Kolbaba. He is the author of Physicians, Untold Stories. His website is www.physiciansuntoldstories.com. Don't forget, Exonation, if you're interested in having a 1-hour, one-time radio show, if you have something that will help the people out there, if you have a special message that you'd like to get across, if you want to talk about the homeless, the needy, the hungry, whatever, as long as it's positive, go to ftpn.com, forthepeoplebroadcastnetwork.com. Fill out a submission form, and one of the segment producers will get in touch with you. No, there's no cost to this. It's our way of paying forward. After all, this is the X Zone, a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. My name is Rob McConnell. Don't go away. And welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. Once again, to visit the X Zone Broadcast Network website, where you can find out about all the shows we have available to you 24/7, 365 around the world. Go to www.xzbn.net. And for the X Zone TV channel, it's on SimulTV at www.simultv.com. Dr. Scott Kolbaba is our special guest. He is the author of Physicians' Untold Stories. His website, physiciansuntoldstories.com. When you're talking to these patients about their experiences, do any of them or have any of the doctors talk to you about dreams that they have had that may have foretold about the events that they were going to be part of?
Yes, there were a couple doctors that had some really incredible dreams, and one of those is Rich Jorgensen, who was a surgeon. And Rich was talking to one of his friends, and she was kind of a hippie 70s type, and she said, the spirit will allow you to tell your dreams to a person that you dreamt about, and you need to do that because that's a way of them communicating with someone. And Rich thought that was an interesting idea, but he couldn't remember many dreams that he had. Well, one night he had this most incredible dream. He dreamt it was kind of a bad dream. He dreamt that one of his good friends, Judge Glasso, who was a prominent judge in the Illinois area, had died of a heart attack, and he could see him in the casket in the funeral home. He could see people crying all around. It was just one of those dreams. Rob, have you ever had a dream that you woke up and you couldn't get it out of your mind because it was just a phenomenal dream?
Definitely.
And so Rich kept thinking about this dream, and he thought about this friend of his that said, you have to tell people. And he was very hesitant to tell his best friend that he saw him dead in his dream. But he had to call him up. He called him up and very hesitantly said, Judge, I had a dream about you last night, and I dreamt that you were dead. Well, the judge kind of laughed about that. That's kind of a preposterous dream. And Rich said, well, I'd like you to do one thing for me. If you could just go get a physical. You probably haven't had a physical for a while. And the judge said, no, I haven't. So Rich said, get a physical, and I'll be very happy then if you get their physical. So the judge went to get a physical. He had a complete exam with EKG and labs and x-rays and so forth. Everything was perfectly fine. So he called up Dr. Jorgensen and said, Rich, okay, I did what you said. The doctor said I'm going to be perfectly fine, and don't worry about me anymore. And Rich got this sick feeling in his stomach, like the dream was so powerful that he said, Judge, I need to have you do one more thing. I dreamt that you had a heart attack. Would you please see a cardiologist? And the judge says, come on, Rich. I did all you said I needed to do with the doctor and so forth and so on. It turns out that he did see the cardiologist. The cardiologist put him on a stress test, which he failed very badly. And then admitted him to the hospital right away, did an angiogram, and he had multiple coronary lesions and what's called a widowmaker.
Right.
Widowmaker is that one main artery that supplies most of the heart with blood. He would have been dead within a few weeks or months had he not had that done. The next day, they decided to do a bypass much sooner than they would normally because they were afraid he would die of a heart attack if they didn't. They did the bypass. He was very successful. It literally saved his life. He lived for many, many years after that, perfectly healthy, and about 1,000 games of golf with Rich Jorgensen later. He was great.
What a story.
What a dream. And so I think we all have dreams sometimes that if they're really powerful, we just need to pay attention to what we dreamt.
Now, before we went to the commercial break with the news, we were talking about how you got into medical school, and you were running upstairs to room 303 to see the professor because he had the ultimate or he had the ultimate ruling who got in and who didn't. So please continue that story.
Well, I got up there, and if I didn't get this class, I would not become a doctor because I had this last year to finish up. There was only organic chemistry was the only prerequisite I needed. If I didn't take that, I'd have to get a regular job and give up my hopes. So I got to this room where there were a bunch of students who were asking about the same thing that I was. Can I get into the class? And I must have looked really sad to the secretary, and I said, I just need 30 seconds of the professor's time. And she said, okay, you can go to the little ante room there where the two professors that are teaching the class are talking. And I sat outside the room. The door was paper thin. I could hear the professors talking about how they didn't have any books. They looked all over for textbooks, and in those days they didn't have computer textbooks, so they had to get the hard copy books, and they had none of the books for the new class, the 30 students that they opened up a class for. They didn't know what they were going to do because the class started the next day. So the one professor left. I walked in to talk with the professor that could make that decision, and I said, listen, I want to, I pleaded my case, and he said, look at this room out there. Everyone wants the same thing you do. I'm very sorry. I just can't accommodate you. And about that point, I knew this was my life on the line. So I said to him, if I can get you the books for your class, will you let me in the class? And all of a sudden, he took a very great interest. He opened his eyes, he looked up at me, his eyebrows went up, and my heart was in my throat by this point, beating as hard as it could. And he said, it was a long pause, and finally he said, can you get me 30? And I said, more. There was another long pause, and then he said, you're in. Now, what are the odds that I could be there at that very moment when the two professors were talking about getting books and the trouble they'd had with getting books, where only I could help them and only they could help me.
But how could you get the 30 books that they couldn't?
They had the books in Aurora University where the class was dropped. They had about 30 or 40 books on the shelves. When they canceled the class, all the books were still in the library, and I knew that and they didn't.
Wow.
So I got in, and it was, I didn't realize at the time, but that truly was some divine intervention that allowed me to get into that class, get into medical school, because had I missed that by 30 seconds, I would have been a different person.
What do you say to people that you meet and, they find out who you are, the book that you read? What are some of the most interesting questions that you get from the public? The public, and especially my patients, to whom I like to tell these stories, have been very, very positive and very supportive. I've received literally no criticism from any of my patients or any of my friends or anyone, basically. And that was shocking to me, that people say that these stories give me hope, they give me peace, they renew my sense there's something else out there. So it has been very positive. And in addition to that, many patients will tell me their own story. They'll say, listen, I've got a story like that too that I've never told anyone. Yeah. And let me tell you. And I've heard some incredible stories from patients. And thank goodness they feel okay to tell those stories now where they didn't before. Is there a common thread that you've seen between the doctors who tell you their stories about their patients? Because this seems like these are very special members of not only the Western medical profession, but of society itself.
I looked for that. I looked to see, are these spiritual people? Are these religious people? Do they have some characteristic in common? And I would say no. These stories and these experiences have happened to doctors that are never go to church, that don't have a belief system. These have happened to very, very spiritual and very religious people. So it's a whole spectrum. And I think that the divine intervention can happen to any of us, whatever our belief system is. And it has changed a number of doctors and changed their lives when they've had an experience like this. You can imagine if you've had something like this happen to you, you're a different person after that. So it's all spectra of doctors.
How have these experiences changed the lives of patients?
Well, I think what many doctors do, and my partner is a good example of this, John Bourne. John will say, when I get that little voice in the back of my head, I listen to that. And I think he and many other doctors that get that little premonition will listen to that. Now, you can't order crazy tests and things that don't make any sense. Right. But, for example, he had a patient the other day who he was clearing for a pre-op for a total joint surgery, and he does a lot of that. And he had this, after they cleared the person that day, he went home and he had this little naggy thought in the back of his head, maybe I should do a stress test on this guy. Maybe I wonder if I should do something like that. And he said, that's that little voice, and he knew he had to do something. So he did a stress test. He failed it. The guy ended up with bypass surgery like the one that Dr. Jorgensen was involved with, and it saved his life because he had severe coronary disease, and had he gone to surgery, he may have had a heart attack and died from that. So I think the doctors are paying attention in many cases to those little thoughts, their little premonitions. And they may just be, some of them are from experience, but some of them I think are from something above that helps us to accomplish what we want to accomplish.
I can attest personally to that intuition, that gut feeling. I was a police officer and criminal investigator for a number of years. And that inner voice, that gut feeling is real. You need to follow it, and so many times I talked to colleagues of mine who said, I should have followed that gut feeling. And I learned at a very early stage in my career in law enforcement that it's there, it's real, follow it.
Yeah, we had a doctor that told me that he was leaving the office after seeing his patients for the day, and he had this feeling that he had to call. He was late for dinner, as many of us always are, and the wife, I'm sure, was sitting home a little bit perturbed with him, like many of us face when we get home late. And he had this feeling he had to talk with this one patient for some reason.
I'm going to have to do it to you again, darn it. I've got to take another break. My producer just told me. Dr. Scott Kolbaba and I will be back as we wrap up this hour here in the X Zone from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. For more information about Dr. Scott Kolbaba, how you can get a copy of his book, Physicians' Untold Stories, visit his website, www.physiciansuntoldstories.com. I'm Rob McConnell. We'll wrap up this hour. Don't go away. And welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. Now, before I get back to our guest this hour, Dr. Scott Kolbaba, who is the author of Physicians' Untold Stories, I would just like to remind everyone that what we've decided to do here at rel-mar is pay things forward. You're probably saying, what's that all about, Rob? Well, it's very simple. We've been doing this. We've been doing our show and the network now for 30 years. We decided that there's a lot of negativity in the world, and there's a lot of people who write us, emails and call us and share their ideas, and the majority of them are super. So what we decided to do is give these people who have ideas, just like yourself who's listening right now, on how to make this a better world, but you've never had the opportunity of getting your message out there. So what we're doing is we are giving a one-time, 1-hour radio show to people who have these ideas, who want to get a message out there, who want to make a positive change in this world of ours. Now, all you need to do to participate is go to www.ftpbn, that's the For the People Broadcast Network, .com. That's ftpbn.com. There's a very simple submission form there. Fill out the submission form. Send it to us. One of our producers will go over it. And if it fits the criteria of what we're looking for, we'll be in touch with you, and we'll set up a date and time where we will give you your very own one-time, 1-hour radio show. That's our way of paying things forward. Because you never know. Somebody may have a solution to a problem out there, but nobody wants to listen. We'll give you that opportunity. And like I said, no obligation to you whatsoever. We will do the production. We will do the marketing. We will do the promoting. We will do the syndication, and we'll also do the distribution. Our way of saying thank you and paying forward. www.ftpbn.com. Dr. Scott Kolbaba is our special guest. He is the author of physiciansuntoldstories.com. He's the author of Physicians' Untold Stories. His website is physiciansuntoldstories.com. First of all, Dr. Scott, thank you ever so much for coming on the show. It's a great pleasure talking to you. And thank you and the other doctors who've given you the permission to share these wonderful stories. And I can only imagine how these stories have changed so many lives.
They were courageous doctors to do this. I agree.
With Christmas coming up, could you tell us about Mary's Christmas Carol?
Sure, this is a good one. This is a Scrooge story all over again. Dave Mokel, who's the one that I told you about earlier, that came up to me in the hallway of the hospital and grabbed me and pulled me into a room to tell me this story. This is his story. And Dave was operating on one of my patients. Now, Mary was a real curmudgeon. That's a medical term for a person that you don't like to see in your office very often, because she never had anything good to say. Why were you late? Why didn't you fill my prescription? There's some people that you see on your schedule and you say, oh no, we don't have to deal with Mary again.
So you've met my mother, I see.
Well, there are a few patients like this. And so Dave was operating on Mary on her ankle, and in the middle of before they started the surgery, they put her to sleep. They administered some antibiotic, and she arrested. She had a code. She stopped breathing. Her heart stopped. She was basically dead. And they found out later it was the antibiotic that they administered. And so when they call a code in the operating room, everyone from the operating rooms next door rushes in, and they started to do CPR, chest compressions. And there was a guy that had particularly red hair underneath his operating cap that was doing the CPR compressions. Dr. Mokel was in charge of the code. He wasn't doing the compressions adequately enough to get perfusion, so Dr. Mokel asked him to step aside. He didn't, and codes are not polite affairs. So he pushed the guy aside. He stumbled away, and Dr. Mokel started to do compressions and CPR, and that's about when the patient started to come around again. Never woke up, but her heart started and everything seemed to come back. And then she went off to the ICU where the cardiologist made the diagnosis of an allergic reaction. About 3 days later, when she was leaving the hospital, Dr. Mokel came to talk with her about the post-rest care and so forth of her ankle, which we never operated on. And she said, "Thank you for saving my life, Dr. Mokel." And he said, he was a very humble guy. That was just a team effort. We did it. Oh, no, she said, "I saw you push that guy with the red hair aside, and I saw you start doing compressions, and that's when I came back." Well, Dr. Mokel got weak knees and had to sit down at that point. He was late for work, but he decided to sit down and listen to the story. And he said, "Well, how did you know that?" And she said, "When I arrested, I rose to the top of the room and I could see everything that happened." And she named dozens of things that no one could have mentioned: the color of the nurse's dress, the color of the stethoscope, the number of people that were there, and she recognized some individuals that were there, and so forth. And Dr. Mokel said, "Well, that's incredible." And then Mary said, "In addition to that, when I was there doing that, my grandmother, who had been dead for many years, came to me and told me that I needed to be a good and kind person, and if I was, there would be a special place in heaven for me." And then the grandmother left, and she went back into her body when her heart started to beat again. Dr. Mokel said, "This is an incredible story." And he tried to reason how scientifically this could happen, and he just couldn't come up with a scientific explanation. This was just an out-of-body near-death experience. And afterwards, I saw Mary in the office. She brought us cookies. She was the nicest person in the world. She had totally turned her life around. She was kind and gentle to all of her relatives and her parents. She didn't live for a very long time after that because she had multiple medical problems and diabetes and so forth. But the time that she was on Earth, she was the kindest, most wonderful person. And I call this Mary's Christmas Carol because she truly had a Scrooge experience where she went from being unkind to the most kind and loving person that you can imagine. And that reminded me of the essence of Christmas.
Isn't that wonderful? It's never too late, is it, Doctor?
No, it isn't. It isn't too late.
Touching briefly on out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, based on the people that you've talked to, what happens when they experience a near-death experience? Do the stories vary, or is it basically the same storyline?
Rob, I've been very surprised. I didn't know anything about these kinds of events and experiences, and you don't learn about this kind of stuff in medical school.
Right.
And after hearing these experiences, I started reading other books and listening to other people talk about their near-death experiences or their out-of-body experiences or their experiences with death or people coming back to help and so forth. And I was surprised to find out that many, many people have had very similar experiences. Yeah. I thought the doctors were very unique in the stories that they had, and they have some very unusual stories. But many of these stories are very similar to the stories of other people and other cultures and other professions. And so I was very surprised that these kinds of things happen over and over, and they're very similar. That was very surprising and shocking to me.
What has been your most significant revelation since working on this project, publishing this book? And I understand there's another book coming out.
Yes, there is.
What has been your most significant life-changing experience or story that you've had, or what is it that has really cemented the belief in what you do and your desire to get it out there to the masses?
I think there were probably two experiences that I had. The one I can think of was the near death of my daughter.
Oh,
my daughter
nice.
Lucy is a show choir girl, and so she dances and sings on stage in high school. And they took a bus to Onalaska, Wisconsin, and it was about a 5-hour drive from Chicago. They left about an hour before we did, and about halfway through, Lucci called me up and said there was a little fire on the bus, and it's no problem, we're okay. And she sounded a little strange to me, but I didn't think too much of it. We hung up, and about an hour later, we came across an area of the expressway that had lots of police cars and fire trucks, and there was this huge flaming structure off to the side. It was a bus.
Oh, no.
It was Lucci's bus. My wife almost freaked out. She said, "That's Lucci's bus." It was totally on flame, on fire. The whole thing was incinerated. And evidently what happened was the rear tire of their bus became a flat tire.
Mm-hmm.
And the rubber was hitting the side of the bus and caught it on fire. And they pulled off, and the bus behind them started texting all the girls in the first bus that their bus was on fire. They had to get out. Well, the fire went very quickly. The bus filled with smoke. The girls only had one escape exit in the front of the bus, and so they had to line up. My daughter Lucci was in the back of the bus. The flames were on the side of the bus. They were going underneath the bus. The bus was filled with smoke. The girls were coughing and screaming. They were trying to get out of the bus before they all burned up. The flames were getting larger and larger, and then the people in the bus behind that said there was something really strange that happened. All of a sudden, it was like a blanket, like a giant hand went over the bus. The flames died down and allowed every single girl to jump off the bus without being harmed the least. When the last girl jumped off the bus, there was a roar of flames that came through the bus and burned everything in the bus.
Oh, my Lord.
Had Lucci been in the bus, she would have been killed. And that was one of the most moving experiences that I've ever had.
Scott, I know that we've got many more stories that we could share with the listeners, but unfortunately we've run out of time for today. I'd love to have you back on anytime your schedule allows, Scott. I admire the work that you do. I love what you're doing. So to you and the other practitioners in the medical community who allowed these stories to come forward and be known, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Rob. It's great to share these stories with you and your listening audience.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Scott. And Exonation, once again, if you'd like more information about Dr. Scott Kolbaba, visit his website, physiciansuntoldstories.com. This Exonation would make a wonderful Christmas gift because this is the season of miracles. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news at 6.5 minutes past the top of the hour as we continue here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell, on the Talkstar Radio Network, Mutual Broadcast Network, X Zone Broadcast Network, and Simul TV. Don't go away.